Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. IPv6. I've talked about IPv6 here before, and if you've been paying attention, you'll know that I'm a booster. I like the concept of having an expanded pool of IP addresses so that everything can have a globally reachable address and we don't need to worry about NAT anymore. And we just need to worry about firewalling for security. Great, wonderful, but we're not there yet, are we? So, how do we get from A to B? Well, as you might expect, IPv6, being the big thing that it is, there's been a lot of work that people have put into figuring out how we get from A to B. And so there are a lot of transition mechanisms that are set up for that. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. Fair warning, right off the bat, I think the IPv6 transition mechanisms are a big part of why a lot of network engineers just kind of throw up their hands and go, this whole IPv6 thing is too complicated. I don't want to have to worry about it. I just want to do my IPv4. And if the world wants to talk to my stuff, then they're going to have to figure out how to speak IPv4 because I ain't changing. IPv6 transition mechanisms are confusing. Really, really confusing. There's multiple strategies and there's a lot of weirdly similar names. Here's an example. Here's 3 different mechanisms. 6 in 4, 6 over 4, and 6 to 4. Let's just, for fun, let's throw in NAT 64 and DNS 64 for good measure. And that's just 5. Now we're going to throw in the 2 that came with Windows 7 back in 2008, ISATAP and Terado as well. Now we're up to 7. And we haven't even scratched the surface yet. The number of transition mechanisms is there to, kind of help say, well, maybe this works better in this situation, maybe this works better in this situation. What it's done, essentially, in my opinion anyway, is confuse a lot of network engineers who are no longer quite as young as they used to be, and for whom learning new concepts is still something that you have to do, but you want to know what you're going to devote your time to. You don't have the time to go learn and become an expert on 12 different transition mechanisms. You just want the thing to work. So let's talk broadly first about the 3 big strategies for doing this. One is simply called dual stack. It's pretty simple in concept. Give everything an IPv4 address and an IPv6 address. Done. If you're talking to an IPv6 machine on the other end remotely, use your IPv6 address. If you're talking to something that's only on IPv4, use IPv4. Pretty simple. Dual stacking is, to a large degree, my preferred mechanism for dealing with this transition. And quite honestly, it's not something that I see going away at any point. If you're running a big internet service, you want to make sure that you're reachable from both types of client. If you go the way of saying, well, everybody has to use IPv4 to talk to my stuff, people who are on IPv6 networks, maybe they don't value your stuff that highly, that they're going to go to the extra trouble to put in a translation or tunneling mechanism, which we'll talk about in a minute, and maybe they don't have a way to get their own IPv4 set up, or it would require NAT and another NAT gateway and all that other stuff. So people who are on IPv6 only, if they want to talk to something that's IPv4 only, maybe they just choose not to. Maybe they choose to build a replacement service that will support both and you find that your stuff is becoming obsolete because it's not moving forward. That's a risk. But you still don't want to move all the way forward to build something that's IPv6 only, because if you're building something that needs to support legacy clients that still haven't made that transition, you're going to need to have both. So fundamentally, for the long period of time ahead of us, I see servers, and particularly cloud servers, they're going to still need both. They're going to need IPv4 and IPv6. So dual stack seems to make a lot of sense to me. Great. The second broad strategy that we're going to talk about is translation. And this is essentially NAT, but specific now to bridging IPv6 and IPv4. And then we're going to talk about the third strategy, which is tunneling, which is similar to a VPN, essentially, but again, specific to this transition between IPv6 and IPv4. So, dual stack, we already kind of covered. It's worth noting that there are also other approaches, one of which, for example, is called dual stack light, or DS light. Essentially, this says, okay, your endpoints might be IPv4 only, but that's not saying that you have to have IPv4 through the entire core network. What if you make sure all your routers know where to send IPv4 traffic towards the endpoints, but all of the next hop addresses for their neighbor routers are IPv6? Then you only need to have IPv6 in the core of the network, and it will send IPv4 traffic just via routers that are IPv6 only, so long as it knows that there's IPv4 on the end and it knows where to send it. Cool? So that is also under the dual stack umbrella, we'll say. But the second one that I mentioned is translation, NAT, essentially. And this is designed to have clients that are in an IPv6 only network, and they need to talk to a server that is IPv4 only. What about the reverse? If you have clients that are IPv4 only and you're trying to get them to talk to IPv6 only, it's not going to work. To some extent, a lot of your transition mechanisms will work if your clients are IPv6 and your server is IPv4, because an IPv4 address is 4 times shorter than an IPv6 address. And so you can take that shorter address and encapsulate that in certain specific, specially determined IPv6 looking addresses that, you know, when a device sees this address, it says, oh, this is actually an IPv4 address, and it's this section of the address header. So you can do that, but you can't go the opposite way. An IPv4 only client has no concept of, I need to talk to a server with an address that's 4 times bigger than anything I understand how to process. And so that's not going to work really well, or at all. So all of the technologies that I'm talking about today are designed for IPv6 clients talking to an IPv4 server. Translation then has to take an IPv6 address and translate that to an external IPv4 address in order to talk to the server. Okay, that's basically NAT64. That's what it is. You've got an internal client that's on 6 talking to an external client on 4. But with that, how do they know what address to even talk to? Because if they do a DNS lookup and they get an IPv4 address for this IPv4 only server, then the client isn't going to use IPv6 to talk to it. If the client is dual stack, it will see that there's only a v4 record, and it'll say, oh, then I need to talk to it over IPv4. Or if it's IPv6 only, it goes, well, how do I talk to this then? Because that's not an address that I understand. That's not an address that I have something that can talk to it. So you usually also see DNS 64 deployed alongside NAT 64. And DNS 64 takes DNS responses from the external network that are IPv4 only and expands them into a compatible IPv6 address and says, oh, there's actually an IPv6 record for this. Here it is. And the client goes, great, I'm going to send to this IPv6 address that's synthetic. It's been synthesized. And that'll go to the NAT gateway, which will then take the IPv4 address of the actual server out and send it along with IPv4 from the NAT gateway. Okay, that's one strategy. It works. It still is using NAT, which I've described before as kind of a crutch, but it's a crutch that people are kind of familiar with, so maybe. But it really ruins the whole concept of end-to-end connectivity, because you're not globally reachable at that point. You've still got a NAT gateway sitting in front of you. If you've got something like that, how are you actually going to be able to receive traffic in there? Or do you have separate gateway processes, one for intercepting IPv4 traffic and putting it through, or one that just goes out via IPv6? To me, it feels messy. It does not feel like an elegant solution, but it works. So it's out there. Fine. So the third big strategy that I mentioned is tunneling. Tunneling's a little different from translation, because with tunneling, we're assuming that we actually have IPv6 on both ends, client end and server end, but we're transiting an IPv4 only network, the core network. DS Lite, like I mentioned, says, okay, well, maybe you have IPv4 on both sides and the inside is IPv6 only. This is the opposite, where IPv6 on both ends, IPv4 in the middle. And this was, to some degree, the anticipated outcome when IPv6 was still being launched. Because, okay, in a business or in an enterprise, the network admin can go, okay, we're going to do IPv6 now. Wave their magic networking wand, and here's all IPv6 internally. And maybe you can say, okay, well, and your remote clients are also going to be IPv6 because we said so. That's what we're going to support. All right, fine. Windows got in on that bandwagon and said, okay, as of 2008, all of our servers support IPv6 primarily. I think that's their first choice going forward, because we want to be on the forefront of moving this thing forward. Okay, cool. Fine, but how does that work when your ISPs are still IPv4 only? Unlike the reverse, where you can forward IPv4 packets among devices that only have IPv6 addresses, if they have IPv6 addresses, then they're more recent. They still understand, or are assumed to understand, the difference between IPv4 and IPv6. So you can take IPv4 traffic, forward it, and just say, I know what this is, I just don't have an address for it, so I'm going to forward it using IPv6 neighbors. Fine. But if you've got IPv4 only core network, they may not understand what IPv6 is. They may look at this bigger destination address and go, this is a huge error, I'm going to drop it. Or they may look at it and go, what's this checksum? I don't understand this checksum. Drop it. It must be corrupt. So Tunneling mechanisms are there specifically to bridge a gap where the ISPs had IPv4 only infrastructure. I'm going to try and talk about the three really confusing ones that I mentioned off the bat: 6-in-4, 6-to-4, and 6-over-4, just to give you an idea of how these are all slightly different from each other and how they're all supposed to work. But again, just to start by the groundwork, clients, IPv6, servers, also IPv6, but we're having to bridge an IPv4 only network. So let's start with 6-to-4. 6-to-4 says, okay, I know that I need to send to an IPv6 address on the server side. But how do I get there? I have an IPv6 address that I'm sending from, and I'm going to assume that the client also knows that it has an IPv4 address available. But it doesn't know if the server has an IPv4 address available, or it doesn't seem to have, the server doesn't seem to have an IPv4 address, because if it did, then both ends are dual stacked and you just do that. So server has IPv6 only, client has 6 and 4 available. Well, the client says, okay, I'm going to say that my destination IPv6 address is going to be the client's v6 address is going to be a specially constructed one that has the IPv4 address in it. This is what's sending the packet. And then it says, okay, I want to wrap this IPv6 traffic in an IPv4 packet and send it to a 6-to-4 router, a relay on the public internet. And there were many of these. Were being the operative word. This is now technically a deprecated protocol, so don't go using this right now. But the idea was you send this to a 6-to-4 relay router, which strips off the IPv4 packet, relays the v6 traffic to the server, and when the server sends back via the relay router, it will wrap that back up in an IPv4 packet, because now it's being responded to a special format IPv6 address that includes an IPv4 address, so that the relay can wrap this back up in an IPv4 packet and address it to the client's external IPv4 and send that back. Confusing, yes. 6-over-4 is a completely separate thing. 6-over-4 says, well, let's just say, we're going to do the address meddling thing as well, but what happens if we just treat our IPv4 network as just a broadcast medium? So you're going to use multicast packets across the IPv4 network to find your IPv6 hosts that are also treating IPv4 as a broadcast medium. You're basically saying the ISP and the entire world are going to become one great big Ethernet network. And I'm just going to announce multicast across that and, try to find destinations for my IPv6 traffic. And then you wrap your IPv6 traffic in an IPv4 packet and send that out. Okay, again, it works, but a big flaw in that was it requires your network to support multicast properly all the way through, so that various endpoints can be discovered. IPv6 really relies on multicast /anycast traffic to efficiently discover things like routes, DNS, services, etc. And not all ISP core networks have multicast configured, true multicast, because multicast is its own complicated thing that I find honestly a little bit of a nightmare to try and figure out, but leaving that aside. So 624 relies on publicly available relay routers that will strip the IPv4 traffic and forward it on through IPv6. Deprecated, do not use. 6/4 treats the core network, requires the core network to have multicast enabled and available, and treats it essentially as a broadcast medium. Okay, your mileage may vary. 6N4 is another thing altogether. With 6N4, you're doing the same thing. You are wrapping your IPv6 packet in an IPv4 shell, but, and here this is a crucial point, the tunnel endpoints are predetermined. This is essentially a statically created tunnel. So you say, okay, when I accept IPv6 traffic, I'm going to wrap this in an IPv4 packet that the destination is my tunnel endpoint over there. And when it reaches the tunnel endpoint, it strips the IPv4 packet off, sends it on to the IPv6 network. When it comes back, okay, it reaches the destination endpoint, the tunnel endpoint, says, okay, I have a tunnel configured that says this IPv6 address range is reachable over here. So it wraps it in an IPv4 packet and sends it to the configured endpoint. This strips out a lot of the complications there because you're not having to try and dynamically discover endpoints by assuming that you can relay multicast through your ISP's network, which may not work. And you're not relying on publicly available relay routers that are just going to hopefully remain available and they'll just do the stripping and relaying and do it all back and forth. You're actually setting up tunnel endpoints. And so your IPv4 network is really just between those two tunnel endpoints. And from either side of the tunnel, you can handle that traffic how you wish, that IPv6 traffic. That also means you don't have to meddle with the address. You're not worried about somehow encoding an IPv4 address into an IPv6 address or anything like that. The tunnel endpoints know what the other destination is. So your IPv6 address can remain constant when the client sends it. The tunnel endpoints take care of putting the IPv4 on and taking it off. And then the IPv6 traffic coming back will go to the tunnel endpoint and then through the tunnel again. You don't have to worry about address chicanery. You don't have to worry about dynamic anything. You don't have to worry about public anything. It just works, typically speaking. This is very useful. This is also the method that Hurricane Electric's tunnelbroker.net service uses, which is a publicly available service. As long as you show that you know something about IPv6 using their IPv6 certification levels, essentially, which is free. There's no charge for proving that you have knowledge for them, fortunately, as opposed to most certifications. If you prove that you have that, you can sign up for a tunnel broker and you can actually create an IPv6 6N4 tunnel to get IPv6 going, even if your ISP doesn't have IPv6 available, which is very useful. Unfortunately, a lot of cloud services, most notably Netflix, but also Hulu, other streaming providers, to some extent Cloudflare, other Microsoft, other Google services, they all say, oh, this is a VPN connection, or this is a proxy service, because we no longer have any guarantee that we know what country you're coming from. And so if we're supposed to geographically isolate shows or do other things, we're just going to block all of these tunnel broker IPv6 ranges because we can't guarantee that you're not trying to bypass some sort of block, which makes it disappointingly problematic to deal with. But it's also worth noting you could probably replicate the same thing by just using a standard VPN and running IPv6 over it. So long as you have a VPN provider that supports IPv6 or you roll your own. That's a topic for another video later down the road. So what about the two I mentioned that came with Windows 7? Isotap and Terado. And I don't know for sure that I'm pronouncing Terado correctly. I apologize if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. It's actually the name of a particular genus of shipworms, marine organisms that like to drill into, wooden ships of old. So that's a fun thing. Isotap is similar to 6/4 in that it treats your IPv4 network essentially as a pipe that you can transmit IPv6 traffic over by encapsulating it in IPv4. But whereas 6/4 assumes that you have multicast available and just tries to determine endpoints by broadcasting or multicasting through it, Isotap assumes that multicast is not available and treats it as a special kind of network, which in networking parlance is a non-broadcast multiple access. So there's multiple stations that can access this transmission medium, but it doesn't support broadcast or multicast. So there's multiple stations on there, but you have no guarantee that everyone can see everyone else. So it's unicast only. It's supposed to be automated. It's supposed to just kick in whenever you need it. Your mileage may vary. I don't know that I ever saw it work. I never saw Terado work either. And Terado is somewhat similar, except it specifically wraps your IPv4 traffic in wraps your IPv6 traffic in IPv4 UDP packets. Rather than using TCP to relay this, it just tries to use UDP to keep it fast and keep it going and have that work. They were included for a decent purpose. But the same way that your 6/4 public Anycast relays have gone away over time, your Terado routers publicly have also gone away over time. So it's not terribly useful these days either. And this is why I say IPv6 transition, I think, is largely responsible for the massive headache that a lot of network engineers have encountered in trying to put this together. Because this many options and things to think about, and, are you relying on public equipment? Are you relying on private equipment? Are you needing to worry about it's being treated as a VPN or a proxy? And then you've got these addresses that are 4 times as bigger and they use hexadecimal instead of dotted decimal. And a lot of network engineers just go, oh, I can't deal with this, thank you. But it's kind of part of the job. So it's one of those things that a network admin needs to think about, plan, and deal with. But if you can, just stick with dual stack. If you can, find an ISP that offers both and just dual stack your way through. Dealing with IPv6 is actually not so bad, so long as you don't have to deal with all of the transition mechanisms on top of that. So dual stack all the way if you can. And if, like me, you're stuck with an ISP at home that does not offer IPv6, well, you're going to have to use one of these transition mechanisms if you want to use IPv6 at all. And then I would say something like 6in4, where you've actually got statically determined tunnels, is probably going to end up being more stable. And you'll just have to work around the fact that services, a lot of public services, say VPN bad, or proxy evil. And well, okay, so you're gonna have to work around that, or try to roll your own type of VPN, and you can do that with WireGuard. I'm gonna see if I can actually rig that up to show you guys my own jerry-rigged type of solution in a future video. Not right today, because this is getting quite long enough. If you have thoughts on other things that you would like to hear me talk about, or things that you'd like to see me demonstrate on a computer, feel free to let me know right down there in the comments section. I hope you found this discussion interesting and enlightening. But for now, why do I suddenly want to end this with "that's all, folks"? No. Craziness. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door netadmin, and we will see you next time.